is my opportunity to talk about the so-called emerging markets. Now, in the financial industry and in the Western world, there's a huge amount of euphoria related with the emerging markets. And I want to dissect the underpinnings of the emerging markets in my talk. I want to talk about what happened to the third world countries when European powers left their colonies. What happened to them until the end of 1980s? And it seems that something changed in the third world countries in the 1980s, which apparently, according to the conventional wisdom, continues today. And these countries are now, third world countries, are now known as emerging markets. I'm going to mostly refer to them as the third world countries because that's what they were and that's what they will continue to be. And I want to show that a lot of euphoria related with these third world countries is unfounded. It's not real, it's not based on facts. British Empire was the largest empire in human history. At the end of the Second World War, Britain had to start pulling out of their colonies. Now, there were many reasons why Britain pulled out of their colonies or why they started pulling out of their colonies. One of the main reasons is undiscussed. One of the main reasons is that Britain brought prosperity in their colonies. Britain brought massive improvement in transportation in their colonies. Britain brought in technology in these countries where technology, the concept of technology, did not exist, and it still does not exist in many cases. Britain brought in telecommunication, which enabled people to talk with each other and collectivize against Britain. But I'm not going to just stick to the economic aspects of what Britain did in the colonies. It was the intellectual aspect of what Britain contributed to the colonies, which is the key in my view. Britain brought in some completely new concepts, completely alien concepts in these countries, in the colonies, the concept of freedom of speech, completely unknown concepts of liberty and freedom. Britain brought in enlightenment to their colonies. Now, you saw the effect of what Britain was doing after British left their colonies. Economic stagnation started rapidly in the colonies after Britain left. And actually, it was the same with other European powers. Once they left Africa, Papua New Guinea, etc., these countries started to decay and degrade rather rapidly. Institutions started fraying in these countries. An age of illiberalism and tyranny is started in the ex-colonies. People don't want to talk about it. Now, when people talk about it, most of the blame goes to two things. Firstly, the blame goes to communism and socialism. Communism and socialism is spread like wildfire in the ex-colonies, now known as third world countries. And almost synchronously, tyrants and dictators rose up in Latin America, in Africa, in South Asia, all of these third world countries. Now, I don't disagree with the proximal issues, but people forgot to dissect why communism was able to sink its roots in these third world countries and why tyranny rose synchronously in the third world. And I'm going to respond to this later, but it seems, again, according to the conventional wisdom, that something changed in the 1980s. And the assumption is that in the 1980s, communism had lost its reputation mostly because USSR disintegrated. Now, conventional wisdom believes that as a consequence of the disintegration of USSR, democracy is spread around the world, economic liberalization started happening around the world, Western education is spread, according to the conventional wisdom again. In my view, this is a completely wrong assessment of the situation. The claimed economic liberalization actually did not happen in these third world countries. What happened was that these governments took one step forward under the pressure of IMF and the World Bank, and they took 2 steps backwards under the guidance of the IMF and the World Bank. The net result is that these countries in the third world have more oppression, more repression of businesses today, and governments have grown exponentially in the third world as a result of massive economic growth that took place in the last 3 decades. So now the question would be that if I disagree with all that happened since the 1980s disagree with the conventional wisdom about end of communism and end of USSR, what was the reason why these third world countries started changing? In my view, there are 2 reasons why these third world countries started to change. One is that there was a real cultural and economic renaissance that started in China. What happened in China not only changed China, but it changed the economic structure of the world. But remember, for the rest of the third world, the benefit they got was because of an extraneous event. But a bigger reason why the third world improved so much economically, and only economically, in these 3 decades was because of telecommunication and internet. Now, most of you might remember in the 1980s, massive cabling of the planet was done. Several telecommunication companies went bankrupt because they over-invested in cabling of the planet. Telecommunication prices fell quite rapidly, and a new technology became common. It started to become common in the world, the internet. The internet changed the economic prospects of the third world. Internet allowed massive transfer of Western technology to the third world, and it enabled wage arbitrage, particularly in non-tradable sectors, to start happening. The wage differential was so massive between the third world and the West that there were so many crumbs to be picked up by the third world. Now, this is the reality. The third world hasn't really changed in any substantial way. The underpinnings of the third world have actually got worse, and the low-hanging fruit have now been plucked. Internet allowed for this to happen, but because these people just became snobby and arrogant, they did not change the underpinnings behind why they were so wretched, poor, and in difficult shape. So let me talk about what is wrong with the third world, why it does not change. Again, as I said, economic development did happen in the last 3 decades, but it had nothing to do with real changes happening in the third world. Almost everything can be attributed to extraneous events. When your life improves before of extraneous events, it might be unsustainable. In my view, it is. Let's talk about what is wrong with the third world. European colonizers, Britain, brought in the rule of law in these countries. They had zero concept of the rule of law. They brought in institutions in these countries. What was happening before? Britain was no saint, but what was happening before colonizers came to these countries? These countries in Africa, Latin America, in South Asia were in a never-ending war, tribal war with each other, and those tribal wars never end because of something that they lack. And I'll come to that in a bit. Now, Britain set up institutional structures for accumulation of intellectual and financial capital to happen in the third world. But over the 200-300 years that ruled these countries, they achieved only marginal improvement in these countries. Now, those of us who have traveled in these countries, in Africa, in India, in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, it will be very difficult for a Western person to understand what is happening in those countries. And I want to tell you something to think about. When you drive around in Africa or in Bangladesh or in India, what you will see is that girls in uniform, school uniform, carrying pots of water on their heads. Now, this is the situation. 2,000 years back, there was water piping available in the Roman Empire. But moreover, the concept of wheel has been in existence for at least 5,500 years, if not longer. So the question is, why do they carry water on their head? Why did they not set up piping? Piping is very cheap these days. If it was cheap in Roman times, why could they not do it today? But even bigger question is, why don't they at least use some basic wheel to transfer the pots of water? Now, most people cannot really grasp what I'm saying. The reality of the third world is that billions of people, and I'm not exaggerating, billions of people in Latin America, Africa, and South Asia still carry heavy stuff on their heads. It is not technology or capital that is stopping them from changing their ways. It's something else. Now, a lot of us, people in the Western world, made fun of China for copying Western technology. Now, the reality is, think through this thing. If copying were that easy, why did Africa not copy it? Why did the Middle East not copy it? Why did Venezuela and Brazil not copy it? Why did Central America not copy it? Why did they just depended on their natural resources? Why not they did more than that? Let me go back a bit about what the psyche was during the Second World War. And I'm going to quote a few quotes from Sir Winston Churchill. There's a reason I'm going to call him Sir, and there's a reason I'm quoting him. Sir Churchill was the wartime president of the United Kingdom, Second World War times. Talking about the future of Palestine, he said, quote, "I do not admit that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race has come in and taken their place," unquote. Talking about Islam, Sir Churchill said, quote, "How dreadful are the curses which Mohammedanism lays on his votaries, besides the fanatical frenzy which is as dangerous in a man as hydrophobia in a dog. there's this fearful, fatalistic apathy. The effects are apparent in many countries. Improvident habits, slovenly systems of agriculture, sluggish methods of commerce, and insecurity of property exist. Unquote. Talking about India, the country that I grew up in, he famously said, "I hate Indians." Go. He goes on to say, "They are beastly people with a beastly religion," unquote. Now, there's another quote attributed to Sir Churchill. I was unable to verify it to an authentic source, so I cannot be sure if he said this or not. But this is the quote. He says, quote, "If independence is granted to India, power will go to the hands of rascals, rogues, freebooters. All Indian leaders will be of low caliber and men of straw. They will have sweet tongues and silly hearts. They will fight amongst themselves, and India will be lost in political squabbles," unquote. So Churchill has been proven correct after 70, 80 years after what he said. And I quoted him because I completely agree with him. Europeans of those days clearly knew that there was something very significantly different between the West and the colonies. What came to be known as Third World, and after the advent of political correctness, what came to be known as the emerging markets. Europeans of those days, British, so Churchill, knew that without the glue and the pillars provided by European managements, British managements, these countries, the Third World, the colonies, would disintegrate and enter a phase of never-ending wars. What happened? You learn wisdom over millennia and you lose it over a single generation. In my view, that has happened in the West. Europeans knew what was the key difference, and they have mostly forgotten that difference. But the problem is that while it looks good to not accept those differences, the reality is that it will come and haunt the West, and it will do no good to the Third World, not accepting the facts, the realities behind these countries. So what is it? What is this real issue with the Third World? I often say that the more intelligent you are, the more handicap you have in terms of understanding stupidity. The more compassionate you are, the more difficult it is to understand the lack of gratitude in other people. What Sweden is doing today is not necessarily because of naivety and stupidity. They just simply don't understand that these ungrateful migrants just don't feel gratitude. It took a very long time for the concept of reason to get infused into the Western society. European institutions are basically a product of the concept of reason. Now again, in front of intelligent people, as I said, intelligent people have a major handicap understanding this concept. You have to keep going to these third world countries, immerse yourself in it before you understand this thing. But if you don't have the concept of reason, communicate with them and you will realize they operate through beliefs and faith. They don't operate, the operating system is not reason in their minds. When that is the case, you cannot differentiate between right and wrong. You cannot differentiate between right and wrong. It's as simple as that. You only differentiate what not to do because your hands get chopped. If you don't have the concept of reason, you cannot differentiate between virtues and sins. Again, some people think it's in our biology and in our instincts, as Dr. Narvison alluded to in certain aspects of philosophy. It is not necessarily in our instincts. Now, here is a problem. If you cannot differentiate between right and wrong, how can you have modern-style judiciary in the third world? How can you have the rule of law if you cannot differentiate between virtues and sins? The end result, ladies and gentlemen, is that when Britain left their colonies, their institutions started to rapidly degrade and decay and start failing. That is why tyrants emerged in those countries. Let me talk about some of the mutation. What happened to these institutions once Europeans left? Now, I have no problems with European institutions. Britain should have stayed back in those countries, of course, for a fee. And 3 countries, as far as I know, still use that. They don't declare it openly. Look closer at Dubai, Singapore, and Hong Kong. They hugely depend on Europeans to provide them intellectual capital and organizational skills. But let's talk about what happened to the institutions in the third world. Education. Now, education, the primary objective of education is to transmit the concept of reasoning and critical thinking. That should be at least the objective. Now, in the third world, the concept of reason is conspicuous by its absence. Let me repeat it. In the third world, the concept of reason is conspicuous by its absence. What happened to education? It just became another belief system in the minds of these people, unassimilated to any principles. Now, what happens when you learn something or learn something by rote? What happens to your mind? It becomes more burdened, not less. The situation actually became worse, not better. Education, around everywhere in the third world, is used for propaganda purposes. Nationalism. Nationalism was a concept that emerged in Europe because there were certain values Europeans believed in. You impose that on irrational people, and irrational people cannot understand the concept of values. What happens? They merely see nationalism as a geographical concept. It is packed with sense of superiority and arrogance. Nationalism today is spreading. The ugly kind of nationalism is spreading like wildfire in the third world today. The country that I grew up in, Hindu fanaticism is growing rapidly. Hindu nationalism is growing rapidly today. If I don't stand up before the start of every movie for the national anthem, which must be run, I would be beaten up and taken to prison and charged for treason. Nationalism has mutated into an ugly concept in the third world. Now, when people talk about the so-called emerging markets, which I call the third world, they feel very euphoric. That's the future of humanity for them. But look closer, and what do you see? Let me mention a few countries here. Myanmar. Myanmar got a whiff of democracy, and the very celebrated Nobel Peace Prize woman, Aung San Suu Kyi, got some power. 2 things immediately happened. Oppression of journalists actually increased significantly in Myanmar. Western media won't report it because Aung San Suu Kyi is so celebrated by the left and by the media in the West. One of the biggest genocide is started in Myanmar against the Muslim minorities of Myanmar. Middle East, most of the Middle East is in flames. Turkey and Malaysia, I'm talking about the mutation that these countries are still going through, except that for the last 3 decades, you might not have perceived them continuing to mutate since the end of colonization. Look at Turkey and Malaysia. They looked like among the most decent countries in the third world. The ugly face of fanaticism is raising its head rapidly in those 2 countries. South Africa was mostly seen as close to being a first world country. Look at the mess they are in today. They are probably entering a phase of civil war, from what I hear. I used to go to South Africa, I don't anymore. Venezuela is imploding, and I don't know the future of Brazil. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, East Timor. Within my lifetime, the world has been very euphoric about these countries, and they are complete messes. Indonesia took a breather for a few years. Fanaticism is rising again, aided and helped by mutated concept of nationalism and education. Education is being used to spread propaganda. India, again, the country that I grew up in, Western press is not even reporting this thing. I have written about 20, 25 articles on long articles on what's been happening in India in the last 8 months. India is very rapidly becoming a police state. British left a concept of free speech in that country. Among the middle class, when I was growing up, it was okay to speak your mind, or at least they paid lip service. Now they beat you up and lynch you for speaking your mind. In fact, the government would even arrest you for saying anything against the prime minister. That did not happen 20, 30 years back in the country. But the Western media is ignoring this because this is the world's biggest democracy, and they like to think that democracy must do well. That's another concept, Western concept, that has completely mutated with no underlying values. It's mob system, nothing else in the third world. Now, Papua New Guinea is a recent example. When Australia was ruling this country, it was improving. I recently spent a bit of time there, and it is very, very rapidly reverting back to its medieval, extremely violent past. If a woman gets raped, I don't even think it is really a crime in that country anymore. Now, we all recognize these things, but we fail to accept. We still like to believe, a lot of people, that the emerging markets are the future of the world. Botswana is another country often quoted as having grown economically the fastest for the longest. What people won't tell you is that it has the population not much more than that of Vancouver. And it has a huge, massive landmass with some of the best natural resource sector in the world on per capita basis. That is what made them rich. And my Botswanian friends tell me the wealth hasn't changed their tribalism or superstitions. And Botswana is way past its peak already. And remember, the leadership, a lot of leadership in many of these countries is still the remnants of what the British left. India, for the last 3 years, has broken completely from the British rule. There's now no connection with what British left in terms of people in leadership positions. So let me conclude my talk here. Britain brought in sanity in the third world. When Britain left, irrationalities, tribalism, and superstitions of the third world started asserting themselves. And from the time that the British left, these countries have continued to deteriorate, including in the last 3 decades, despite that it might not seem that way. They only grew economically in the last 3 decades, and they have accepted a lot of lifestyle problems related with getting money and wealth without having developed reason and critical thinking. These institutions cannot be maintained by the local people. They will continue to degrade, decay, and disintegrate. My view is that the third world is entering the last phase of plucking the leftover fruit from the free gift of Western technology. Economically, they will continue to stagnate. Again, the world might not believe that for now, but that is what I see with my eyes. When economically they start to stagnate, tyrants will emerge, will become visible again in these countries, including, and probably the fastest in the country that I grew up in, India. Now, this will be happening exactly when the last remnants of the British Empire also enter the history books, because they retire from leadership positions. What I see is an extremely ugly future of the third world. And this is very interesting because most of the people in the West think that it is the West which is decaying, which it is. But the real suffering will happen in the third world, in my view, not very far in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.